A simple scar, a chance encounter, and a truth so shocking it would shatter everything a billionaire thought he knew about his past. What started as an ordinary dinner at an upscale restaurant became the key to unlocking a family mystery that had haunted one of the world's wealthiest men for over 3 decades. This isn't just a story about money or power. This is about the invisible threads that connect us all, and how sometimes the most profound discoveries come from the most unexpected places. The Meridian Club wasn't just a restaurant, it was a fortress of exclusivity, perched on the 42nd floor of Manhattan's most prestigious building. Here, deals worth billions were sealed over Wagyu beef, and conversations that could topple governments whispered between courses of truffle risotto. The waiting list for a table stretched months, and even then money alone couldn't guarantee entry. You needed connections, influence, the kind of social currency that couldn't be bought or borrowed. Victoria Chen had been serving tables at the Meridian Club for 18 months, and every shift felt like walking through a museum of untouchable wealth. The crystal stemware cost more than her monthly rent. The silk tablecloths were replaced daily, discarded after a single use. She moved through this world of excess like a ghost, visible only when needed, invisible the moment her service was complete. At 28, Victoria carried herself with a quiet dignity that the regular patrons rarely noticed. Her black hair was always pulled back in a perfect chignon, her uniform pressed to crisp perfection. But if you looked closely, really looked, you'd notice the thin white line that traced from her left temple down to her cheekbone. It was faint now, barely visible unless the light caught it just right. A childhood accident, she'd tell anyone curious enough to ask. A fall from her bicycle when she was 7. Nothing dramatic, just one of those scars that life leaves behind. She had no idea that this small mark would change everything. The evening started like any other. The usual parade of hedge fund managers, tech moguls, and old money aristocrats filled the dining room. Victoria served them with practiced efficiency, her movements fluid and unobtrusive. She'd learned to read the subtle signs that separated the merely wealthy from the truly powerful. The way they held their phones, the quality of their watches, the particular shade of confidence that came from never having to check a bank balance. That's why she noticed him immediately. Harrison Blackwood sat alone at table 12, a corner spot with panoramic views of the city skyline. He was different from the usual clientele, though she couldn't quite pinpoint why. His suit was impeccably tailored, clearly custom-made, but there was something in his posture that suggested discomfort rather than entitlement. He studied the menu with unusual intensity, as if the wine list held secrets worth deciphering. At 62, Harrison was a legend in the financial world. Blackwood Capital had grown from a small investment firm into a global empire worth over $40 billion. He owned newspapers, television networks, real estate portfolios that spanned continents. Politicians sought his endorsement, celebrities courted his attention, and business schools taught case studies based on his strategies. Yet here he sat, fidgeting with his napkin like a nervous teenager on a first date. The truth was, Harrison hated these dinners. They were necessary theater, performances required to maintain the relationships that kept his empire running. Tonight's guest was supposed to be Senator Patricia Williams, chair of the Banking Committee. Another tedious evening of carefully orchestrated charm and strategic flattery. But the senator had canceled at the last minute, leaving Harrison alone with his thoughts and a reservation he couldn't bring himself to waste. Victoria approached his table with the practiced smile she'd perfected over countless shifts. "Good evening, Mr. Blackwood. Can I start you with something from our wine selection tonight?" He looked up, and for a moment something flickered across his face. Not recognition exactly, but a strange sort of curiosity. His eyes lingered on her face longer than necessary, and she felt a flutter of self-consciousness. Had she missed something in her appearance? Was her makeup smudged? "Just water for now," he said, his voice carrying the measured tone of someone accustomed to being listened to. And perhaps you could recommend something from the menu. I'm afraid I'm dining alone this evening. Of course. The chef's special tonight is our dry-aged ribeye with roasted bone marrow and seasonal vegetables. It's quite popular with our guests. She noticed he wasn't really listening to her words. His attention seemed fixed on her face, specifically on the left side where her scar traced its faint path. The scrutiny made her uncomfortable, but she maintained her professional composure. That sounds perfect, he said finally, though she suspected he would have agreed to anything she suggested. And perhaps a bottle of your house red. As she turned to leave, he spoke again. Excuse me, but may I ask about your scar? The question caught her off guard. In 18 months of serving at the Meridian Club, no customer had ever asked her anything personal. The wealthy didn't see service staff as individuals with stories worth hearing. They were functionaries as interchangeable as the crystal glasses or silver forks. It's nothing dramatic, she replied, instinctively touching the mark. A childhood accident. I fell from my bicycle when I was 7. Harrison's expression grew more intense. Where did this happen? What city? Victoria hesitated. The conversation had veered into territory that felt inappropriately personal. But something in his tone made her answer. San Francisco. I grew up in Chinatown. The words seemed to hit him like a physical blow. His face went pale and his hand gripped the edge of the table. For a long moment he said nothing, just stared at her with an expression she couldn't decipher. What year were you born? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Now she was truly uncomfortable. Sir, I'm not sure this is appropriate. Perhaps I should get your dinner order started, please, he said, and there was something almost desperate in his tone. This is important. What year? 1995, she replied reluctantly. Harrison closed his eyes and took a shaky breath. When he opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew his phone, scrolling through what appeared to be a photo album. After a moment, he turned the screen toward her. The image showed a much younger Harrison, maybe in his early 30s, standing next to a beautiful Asian woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. Between them stood a little girl, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, with long black hair and a bright grin that revealed a missing front tooth. The child bore an unmistakable resemblance to Victoria. But it was the thin white line on the girl's left temple that made Victoria's world tilt on its axis. Do you remember a man named David Chen? Harrison asked, his voice thick with emotion. He would have been your father. Victoria's legs felt weak. She gripped the back of an empty chair to steady herself. David Chen had indeed been her father's name, though she'd never known him. Her mother, Lynn, had raised her alone in a cramped apartment above a dim sum restaurant. Whenever Victoria asked about her father, her mother would grow sad and change the subject. She died when Victoria was 19, taking whatever secrets she'd harbored to her grave. I don't understand, Victoria whispered. Harrison stood up slowly as if moving through water. He was a tall man, but now he seemed diminished, vulnerable in a way that didn't match his reputation as a corporate titan. My name is Harrison Blackwood, but 30 years ago I went by Harry. I was working in San Francisco, trying to build my first investment firm. I met your mother at a coffee shop in Chinatown. The restaurant around them continued its elegant dance of service and consumption, but Victoria felt as if she and Harrison existed in a bubble separate from the world. Other diners chatted quietly over their meals, unaware that a life-changing revelation was unfolding just feet away. Lynn was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. Harrison continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. She was working 2 jobs to support herself while studying business at San Francisco State. We fell in love, and for 8 months I thought I'd found my future. But then my father found out about our relationship. He paused, running a hand through his silver hair. In those days, my family's money came with strings attached. Old money, old prejudices. My father threatened to cut me off completely if I didn't end things with Lynn. He said I was throwing away my inheritance for an inappropriate relationship. Victoria felt a cold anger building in her chest. You abandoned her because your family didn't approve? Harrison's face crumpled with shame. I was 28 years old and thought I was so smart, so independent. But when faced with losing everything I'd worked for, everything I thought I needed to succeed, I chose money over love. I broke up with Lynn without explanation. I told her I was moving back to New York, that it had been fun but wasn't serious. I never told her about the pregnancy. The pregnancy. The words hit Victoria like a thunderbolt. Her mother had been pregnant when Harrison left. She'd been carrying Victoria when the man she loved disappeared from her life without explanation. I tried to find her later, Harrison said, his voice breaking. When I realized what a mistake I'd made, when I understood that real wealth isn't measured in dollars, but she'd moved, changed her name. I hired private investigators for years, but they never found a trace. I never knew about you until tonight. Victoria's mind reeled with the implications. This man, this billionaire who commanded respect and wielded incredible power, was claiming to be her father. The father she'd wondered about her entire life, whose absence had left a hole in her childhood that she'd learned to carry like a familiar weight. But how could you know just from looking at me? She asked, though even as she spoke, she recognized the similarities in their facial structure, the shape of their eyes. Harrison smiled through his tears. You have your mother's beauty, but you have my stubborn chin. And that scar, that exact scar in that exact place. I remember the day it happened. Lynn called me crying, saying you'd fallen off your bicycle outside the apartment building. She was so scared, thought it would leave a permanent mark. I told her scars just meant you were living life fully. The memory felt like a key turning in a lock Victoria didn't know existed. Her mother had mentioned that call years later when Victoria was old enough to understand. She'd said Victoria's father had been kind about the accident, had made her feel better about the scar. It was one of the few times Lynn had mentioned him with anything approaching warmth. Standing in that opulent restaurant, surrounded by the quiet murmur of wealth and privilege, Victoria felt her understanding of herself shift fundamentally. She wasn't just a waitress serving tables to pay rent. She wasn't just the daughter of a hard-working immigrant who'd struggled to make ends meet. She was the child of one of the most powerful men in America, a man who'd spent 30 years regretting the choice that had shaped both their lives. But with this revelation came a flood of questions that would change everything she thought she knew about her past, her present, and the future that stretched ahead of her. The scar that had marked her since childhood was about to mark the beginning of an entirely new chapter in her life. The silence between them stretched like a taut wire. Around them, the Meridian Club continued its choreographed dance of luxury and power. But Victoria felt as if the world had tilted off its axis. Her hand moved unconsciously to her scar, tracing the thin line that had just become the most important mark on her body. Harrison reached into his wallet and pulled out a worn photograph, its edges soft from years of handling. The image was faded but clear enough to see a young couple sitting on a park bench, the woman's head resting on the man's shoulder. Between them sat a toddler with chubby cheeks and bright eyes pointing at something beyond the camera's frame. This was taken at Golden Gate Park, Harrison said, his voice thick with memory. You were 3 years old. Your mother packed a picnic lunch and we spent the whole afternoon watching you chase pigeons. You were fearless even then, running toward anything that caught your interest. Victoria stared at the photograph and suddenly fragments of memory began surfacing. Flashes of a man's deep laugh, strong hands lifting her toward the sky, the feeling of being safe and loved. These weren't new memories exactly, but ones she'd buried so deep she'd convinced herself they were dreams. "Why are you showing me this now?" she asked, though her voice betrayed the emotional storm brewing inside her. "Because I never stopped looking for you," Harrison replied. "Because every day for 30 years I've wondered what kind of person you became, whether you were happy, whether you needed anything. Because I've built an empire worth $40 billion and none of it means anything without knowing that you're okay." So good. The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy blanket. This wasn't some chance encounter or remarkable coincidence. This was the collision of two lives that had been orbiting each other in separate universes. Finally pulled together by gravity neither of them had expected. "I need to sit down," Victoria whispered. Harrison immediately gestured to the chair across from him. She sank into the plush leather, her legs no longer steady enough to support her. The other diners in the restaurant continued their conversations, oblivious to the fact that a family was being reunited just feet away from their discussion of stock portfolios and vacation homes. "Tell me about your mother," Harrison said gently. "Tell me about Lynn." Victoria's throat tightened. "She died 9 years ago. Cancer. She fought it for 2 years, but the treatments were expensive and our insurance didn't cover everything. She worked until 3 weeks before she passed away, trying to pay the medical bills." Harrison's face went ashen. "She worked herself to death paying for cancer treatment?" Victoria nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "She cleaned office buildings at night and worked at a dry cleaner during the day. I took care of her the best I could, but I was only 19 and had no idea how to navigate the healthcare system. By the time we found specialists who might have been able to help, it was too late." The silence that followed was deafening. Harrison stared at his hands, his shoulders shaking with what Victoria realized were suppressed sobs. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red with grief and rage. "I could have saved her," he said, his voice breaking. "If I'd found you both sooner, if I'd never left in the first place." Victoria felt a complex mixture of emotions washing over her. Grief for her mother who'd struggled so much, anger at this man who'd abandoned them both. But she remained silent. "She wasn't bitter about you," she said after seconds that felt like hours. "She never spoke badly about my father, even when I was pressing her for details. Even when I could see this sad look in her eyes, she'd say that sometimes good people make choices they regret for the rest of their lives," Harrison mumbled. "After everything I'd done to her." A waiter approached their table, clearly sensing the emotional intensity but maintaining professional discretion. "Is everything okay?" Now that she knew what to look for, she was noticing the shape of his nose, the way he held his shoulders, even the pattern of lines around his eyes when looking up. "We need a few more minutes." "We need a few more minutes," he said politely. The waiter withdrew as Victoria was studying the features of this man who claimed to be her father. "What happens now?" she asked. "I thought I knew what I'd say when I found you. I prayed for this moment 1,000 times." Harrison looked up, his expression raw. "I suppose I hoped for forgiveness, but I'm not sure I deserve it." Victoria considered this. The logical part of her mind was screaming warnings. This could be an elaborate con, some wealthy man's fantasy, a case of mistaken identity that would unravel under scrutiny. But her heart recognized something deeper, something that transcended logic and evidence. "I need proof," she said. "I need to know for certain that you're telling me the truth." "Of course," Harrison replied immediately. "We can do DNA testing, background checks, whatever you need. I have documents from those years, letters your mother wrote me before everything fell apart. I kept them all." He reached into his jacket again and withdrew a small envelope, yellowed with age. The address was written in delicate handwriting that Victoria recognized instantly. Her mother's careful script, each letter formed with the precision of someone who'd learned English as a second language. "She wrote this to me after our last fight," Harrison said. "I never opened it. I was too ashamed, too afraid of what it might say. Maybe it's time." With trembling fingers, he broke the seal and unfolded a single sheet of paper. As he read silently, tears began streaming down his face. After a moment, he handed the letter to Victoria. The paper was fragile, but the words were clear. "My dearest Harry, I know you think you must choose between your family's money and our love. But you are wrong about what love requires. Love doesn't demand that you sacrifice your dreams or abandon your future. Love asks only that you be honest about what you want and brave enough to fight for it. I am carrying your child, and I want you to know that this baby will be loved whether you choose to be part of our lives or not. But I hope you choose us. I hope you choose the family we could build together. I will always love you no matter what you decide. Lynn." Victoria read the letter twice, her mother's voice echoing in every word. This was proof more convincing than any DNA test could provide. Only her father would have received this letter, and only someone who truly knew Lin Chen would understand the quiet dignity in her words. "She never told me about the letter," Victoria whispered. "Because she was giving me a choice, and I chose wrong," Harrison said. "She spent 30 years protecting my reputation while raising our daughter alone." The revelation hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they were ready to cross. Victoria had spent her entire life wondering about her father, creating elaborate stories about who he might be and why he'd left. Never in her wildest imagination had she pictured this. A billionaire sitting across from her in Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant, claiming that a childhood scar had led him back to the daughter he'd lost. But perhaps the most shocking part wasn't the money or the power or even the dramatic nature of their reunion. It was the realization that her mother had carried this secret for decades, protecting both Victoria and Harrison from the pain of knowing what they'd lost. Lin Chen had been stronger and more generous than either of them had understood. "I want to know everything," Victoria said finally. "I want to know about those 8 months with my mother, about why you really left, about what you've been doing for 30 years. But first, I need to know something else." Harrison leaned forward, hanging on her every word. "What kind of man are you now?" she asked. "Because the father who abandoned us 30 years ago, I can understand him. He was young and scared and made a terrible choice. But the man sitting in front of me has had 3 decades to become someone different." "Who did you become, Harrison Blackwood?" The question pierced through the emotional haze of their reunion and demanded honesty of a different kind. This wasn't about the past anymore. This was about whether the man who'd found her was someone worth knowing, someone worth forgiving, someone worth calling father. Harrison's answer would determine not just their future relationship, but whether this chance encounter would heal old wounds or create new ones. Victoria waited, her heart pounding for the words that would shape the rest of her life. Harrison stared at the city lights twinkling beyond the restaurant's windows, gathering his thoughts like a man preparing to confess his deepest sins. The question hung in the air between them, and Victoria could see him wrestling with how much truth he was willing to reveal. "I became exactly what my father wanted me to be," he said finally. "Ruthless, calculating, successful beyond measure. For the first 10 years after leaving San Francisco, I threw myself into building Blackwood Capital with a fury that bordered on obsession." He paused, his fingers fidgeting. "But my success was built on my ability to spot weakness in companies and use them for my financial benefit. I became known as the corporate vulture in the financial press." Victoria listened without a word. "I bought the companies, liquidated them weeks later. I became everything I despised about my own father. I became used to destroy lives for profit. One night I could not lie to myself anymore. I sat on the edge of my penthouse terrace for hours, remembering all the harm done. I realized I'd spent 15 years telling myself that leaving you and your mother had made me stronger, when really it had just made me hollow. I stayed there for hours, but finally I did not jump." "What did you do?" Victoria asked quietly. I changed everything, he replied, and for the first time since she'd sat down, there was something approaching hope in his voice. I established the Morrison Foundation in Samuel's memory, dedicated to supporting family-owned businesses facing financial difficulties. I've spent the last 15 years trying to save companies instead of destroying them, helping families instead of crushing them. He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone, showing her a series of photos. Small businesses, family restaurants, manufacturing companies, all bearing plaques indicating support from the Morrison Foundation. I've probably saved more jobs than I destroyed in my corporate raider days, Harrison said. But the numbers don't matter. What matters is that I finally understood what your mother was trying to tell me in that letter. Love doesn't require you to abandon your dreams, but it does require you to examine what those dreams are built on. Victoria studied the photos, seeing genuine pride in his expression for the first time. These weren't the calculated gestures of a man trying to buy redemption. These were the actions of someone who genuinely changed the fundamental direction of his life. But the most important thing I did, Harrison continued, was never stop looking for you both. Even when the private investigators came up empty year after year, even when my lawyers said I was throwing money away for nothing, I kept searching. I set up Google alerts for your mother's name, paid services to monitor public records across the country. I've probably spent more money looking for you than some people see in a lifetime. This admission struck Victoria differently than the business stories. She could see the genuine anguish in his eyes, the pain of a man who'd spent 3 decades wondering about the family he'd abandoned. "Why the Meridian Club?" she asked. "Of all the restaurants in New York, how did you end up here tonight?" Harrison's expression grew rueful. "Pure chance, if you believe in that sort of thing. Senator Williams was supposed to meet me here to discuss some banking legislation. When she canceled, I almost left. But something made me stay. Maybe it was fate, maybe it was guilt, maybe it was just stubbornness. I've never been one to waste a reservation." Victoria almost smiled at this. Even in the middle of a life-changing revelation, her father was revealing himself to be the kind of man who wouldn't waste an expensive dinner reservation. "The senator's cancellation might have been the luckiest break of my life," Harrison added, "though I suppose I should send her a thank you note for standing me up." This time, Victoria did smile, and she saw Harrison's face light up in response. It was such a simple expression, but she could see how much her approval meant to him. "I have more questions," Victoria said. "About the years you were with my mother, about your family, about what you expect from me now." "Ask me anything," Harrison replied immediately. "I've had 30 years to think about what I'd say if I ever found you. I won't lie to you, not about anything. Tell me about your family, the ones who made you choose between money and love." Harrison's expression darkened. "My father died 12 years ago, still convinced he'd saved me from making the biggest mistake of my life. My mother passed 5 years after that. Neither of them ever knew they had a granddaughter. My father went to his grave believing he'd protected the family legacy by forcing me to abandon the woman I loved." There was bitter irony in his voice that Victoria couldn't miss. He'd chosen his family's approval over love, and that family was now gone, leaving him alone with his regrets. "I have a younger sister, Margaret," Harrison continued. "She's always been the favorite, the one who married appropriately and produced the right kind of grandchildren. When I finally told her about you and your mother a few years ago, she was horrified. Said it was better that you'd never been found, that it would only complicate things." Victoria felt a stab of hurt at this. She had an aunt who didn't want to know her, cousins who might never accept her existence. "Margaret represents everything I used to be," Harrison said, as if reading her thoughts. "Everything I'm trying not to be anymore. If you decide you want a relationship with me, you should know that not everyone in the Blackwood family will welcome you with open arms." This was another layer of complexity Victoria hadn't considered. She wasn't just potentially gaining a father. She was potentially entering a world of family politics and old money prejudices that had already rejected her once. "What about you?" Harrison asked. "Tell me about your life, your dreams, your relationships. I want to know who you became despite my absence." Victoria felt suddenly self-conscious. Her life seemed small compared to his world of corporate empires and family foundations. But she'd learned from serving wealthy customers that the size of your world mattered less than what you did within it. "I graduated from NYU with a degree in social work," she said. "I wanted to help families like ours, families where one person's choices ripple out and affect everyone else. But the pay was terrible. And after Mom got sick, I couldn't afford to work in nonprofit anymore. That's how I ended up here." She gestured around the elegant restaurant. "It pays well, and the hours let me volunteer at a community center in Queens on weekends. I teach English to new immigrants, help them navigate the system. It's not saving the world, but it matters." Harrison's eyes filled with tears again. "Your mother would be so proud of you," he whispered. "She always believed that the measure of a person wasn't what they accumulated, but what they gave back." Victoria felt a warmth spreading through her chest. For the first time in years, she felt truly seen, not just as a service provider or a helping hand, but as a complete person with her own values and dreams. "I'm not expecting anything from you," she said suddenly. "I don't want you to think I need your money or that I'm looking for some kind of rescue. I've built a life for myself and I'm proud of it." Harrison nodded slowly. "I can see that, and I respect it more than you know. But I hope you'll let me be part of that life, even if it's just as a friend at first. I've missed 30 years of watching you grow up. I'd like to be there for whatever comes next." The offer hung between them, loaded with possibility and risk in equal measure. Victoria could feel the weight of the decision pressing down on her. This man claimed to be her father, and everything she'd seen tonight suggested he was telling the truth. But accepting that truth meant accepting all the complications that came with it. She thought about her mother, working 2 jobs and never complaining, protecting a secret that might have changed all their lives. She thought about the scar on her face that had led to this moment, this chance encounter that had pulled apart the careful fabric of her understanding about her own life. "I need time to process this," Victoria said finally. "This is the biggest thing that's ever happened to me, and I don't want to make any decisions while I'm still in shock." Harrison nodded immediately. "Of course. Take all the time you need. Here's my private number," he said, writing on the back of a business card. "Call me when you're ready to talk more, whether that's tomorrow or next month or next year." Victoria took the card, noting that his handwriting was surprisingly similar to her own. Another small piece of evidence in an evening full of revelations. "But I do want to know more," she added. "About my mother. About those 8 months. About who I might have been if things had been different." "You were loved," Harrison said simply. "Whatever else you need to know, start with that. Your mother loved you completely, and I loved you both more than I had the courage to fight for at the time." Victoria stood up, her legs still unsteady but her mind beginning to clear. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a complex mixture of hope and uncertainty. "I should get back to work," she said. "My manager will be wondering where I disappeared to." Harrison stood as well, and for a moment they faced each other across the small table that had become the bridge between their separate worlds. "Victoria," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for listening. Thank you for giving me a chance to explain. Your mother raised an extraordinary woman, and I'm honored to have found you." As she walked back toward the kitchen, Victoria could feel his eyes following her. The other diners continued their conversations about market trends and vacation homes, unaware that they'd just witnessed a family reunion 30 years in the making. Her scar tingled slightly as she touched it. This mark that had been nothing more than a childhood accident until tonight. Now it felt like a beacon, a signal that had somehow guided her father back to her across 3 decades of separation and regret. The rest of her shift passed in a blur of automatic motions and racing thoughts. She served courses and cleared plates while her mind processed the impossibility of what had just occurred. By the time the restaurant began to empty, she'd almost convinced herself the entire encounter had been some elaborate hallucination. But Harrison's business card remained in her pocket, solid and real. Proof that her understanding of her own identity had just been completely rewritten. When Victoria's shift ended at midnight, she found herself walking the empty streets of Manhattan in a daze. The city that never sleeps seemed unusually quiet, as if the universe itself was holding its breath while she processed the evening's revelations. Her reflection caught in storefront windows as she passed, and each time she saw her scar, she felt a jolt of recognition that was entirely new. She rode the subway back to her small apartment in Queens, the business card burning a hole in her pocket like a talisman from another world. Other late-night passengers dozed in their seats or stared at their phones, completely unaware that the woman across from them had just discovered she was the daughter of one of America's most powerful men. Her apartment felt different when she walked through the door. The same cramped kitchen, the same second-hand furniture, the same stack of bills on the counter. But now these familiar surroundings felt like props in a play she'd been unknowingly performing her entire life. Everything looked exactly the same, yet nothing would ever be the same again. Victoria made herself a cup of tea and sat at her small dining table, the one her mother had bought at a thrift store 20 years ago. She pulled out Harrison's business card and studied it under the harsh fluorescent light. Harrison Blackwood, Chief Executive Officer, Blackwood Capital. Below his name was an address that placed his office in the most expensive real estate in Manhattan. She thought about her mother's final days when the medical bills had piled up like accusatory letters from a world that didn't care about their struggle. Lynn had never complained, never expressed bitterness about facing cancer alone. But sometimes Victoria had caught her staring out the hospital window with an expression of profound sadness that went deeper than physical pain. Had she been thinking about Harrison during those moments? Had she wondered what their lives might have been like if he'd chosen differently 30 years ago? The questions multiplied in Victoria's mind, each one opening doors to rooms. She picked up her phone 3 different times to call Harrison she'd never known existed in the architecture of her own history, then put it down again. What was the protocol for contacting your newly discovered billionaire father? Should she text first? Schedule a formal meeting? The absurdity of the situation struck her, and she found herself laughing out loud in her empty apartment. The next morning brought a different kind of clarity. Victoria called in sick to work for the first time in 18 months, ignoring the disapproval in her manager's voice. She needed time to think, to research, to understand exactly who Harrison Blackwood was beyond the man she'd met in the restaurant. Her laptop, ancient and slow, struggled to load the search results for Harrison's name. But what she found painted a picture of complexity that matched what she'd seen the night before. Articles from the early 2000s described him as ruthless, calculating, a corporate predator who dismantled companies like a mechanic stripping cars for parts. But more recent pieces told a different story. The Morrison Foundation had indeed been established 15 years earlier, and its impact was substantial. Victoria found testimonials from family business owners who credited Harrison with saving not just their companies but their communities. A furniture maker in North Carolina whose family had been crafting pieces for 4 generations. A bakery in Minnesota that had been serving the same town for 60 years. A small publishing house in Oregon that specialized in regional authors. Each story followed a similar pattern. A family business facing financial crisis, often due to larger corporations or economic downturns beyond their control. The Morrison Foundation would step in with low-interest loans, business consulting, and sometimes direct grants. But what struck Victoria most was that the foundation never demanded equity or control in return. They simply helped, then stepped back. She found a video interview from 2 years earlier where Harrison discussed the foundation's work. The man on screen was polished and professional, but she could see something in his eyes that reminded her of their conversation the night before. A sadness that money and success hadn't been able to heal. "Every business we save represents families," Harrison had said to the interviewer. "Children who get to keep their homes, parents who maintain their dignity, communities that preserve their character. These aren't just economic transactions, they're about preserving the fabric that holds people together." Victoria paused the video and stared at his face on her screen. There was no doubt now about the physical resemblance. The shape of his jaw, the way his eyes crinkled when he spoke with passion, even the gesture he made with his hands when emphasizing a point. These were her mannerisms too, inherited traits she'd never understood the source of until now. But beyond the physical similarities, she recognized something deeper. The way he talked about family and community echoed her own values, the principles that had driven her to study social work despite the financial challenges. They might have lived in different worlds for 30 years, but they seemed to share the same compass pointing toward helping others. Her phone rang, startling her out of her research trance. The number was unfamiliar, but something made her answer. "Victoria? This is Harrison. I hope you don't mind that I called. I couldn't sleep last night, and I wanted to make sure you were okay." His voice sounded different over the phone, less formal than it had been in the restaurant. More vulnerable. "I'm okay," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure that was true. "I've been doing some reading about you, about the foundation, and what do you think?" There was genuine anxiety in his question, as if her opinion could validate or condemn 30 years of trying to become a better man. "I think my mother would have been proud of what you became," Victoria said, and she heard him draw in a sharp breath. Not the corporate raider from the early years, but the man who decided to build instead of destroy. "She always saw the best in people," Harrison said softly. "Even when they couldn't see it in themselves." They talked for over an hour, filling in details from their separate lives. Harrison told her about the loneliness of success, how every relationship felt transactional when people knew how much money you had. Victoria shared stories about her volunteer work, about the immigrant family she helped navigate systems that seemed designed to exclude them. "I have an idea," Harrison said as their conversation was winding down. "There's something I'd like to show you if you're willing. But it would mean coming to my office." Victoria felt her stomach flutter with nervousness. The Meridian Club had been neutral territory, a place where she belonged as much as he did. But Blackwood Capital was his domain, a symbol of everything that had kept them apart for 30 years. "What is it?" she asked. "Your mother's letters," Harrison said. "I kept them all. Every single one she wrote during those 8 months we were together. And some things that belonged to her. Things I should have returned but couldn't bring myself to part with." The offer hung in the air between them, loaded with possibility and pain. Victoria had so few mementos of her mother's early life, just a handful of photographs and some jewelry that had been pawned during the worst of their financial struggles. The chance to see her mother's words from that time, to understand what she'd been thinking and feeling, was irresistible. "When?" Victoria asked. "Whenever you're ready. Today, tomorrow, next week. I've waited 30 years. I can wait as long as you need." Victoria looked around her small apartment, at the life she'd built through determination and sacrifice. In a few hours, she could be sitting in a billionaire's office, reading love letters her mother had written to a man Victoria had never known existed. The juxtaposition was surreal. but it felt like the next step in a journey she'd unknowingly been taking her entire life. "Today," she said, "this afternoon, I think I'm ready to know the whole story." As she hung up the phone and prepared to venture into Harrison Blackwood's world, Victoria touched her scar one more time. This mark that had once been nothing more than a childhood accident had become the key to unlocking a family history she'd never imagined. And somehow, she knew that her mother would have approved of the courage it was taking to walk through that door. The real test wasn't whether Harrison was telling the truth about being her father. The real test was whether either of them was brave enough to build a relationship from the fragments of a love story that had been interrupted 30 years ago. Sometimes the most extraordinary journeys begin with the smallest details. A scar barely visible unless the light catches it just right. A question asked by a stranger in an upscale restaurant. A childhood memory that bridges 3 decades of separation and regret. Victoria's story reminds us that family isn't just about blood or shared history. It's about the courage to reach across the void of time and circumstance, to forgive the unforgivable, and to believe that love can survive even the cruelest choices. Harrison spent 30 years searching for redemption, building an empire that couldn't fill the hole left by the family he'd abandoned. Victoria spent 30 years wondering about the father she'd never known, carrying his legacy in the shape of her face and the values her mother had quietly instilled. In the end, it wasn't money or power that brought them together. It was a mother's love that had protected them both, even in death. Lin Chen had raised a daughter strong enough to forgive and kept alive the memory of a man worth finding again. What started as an ordinary dinner became proof that the threads connecting us are stronger than time, stronger than pride, stronger than the fear that keeps us apart. Sometimes all it takes is someone brave enough to ask about a scar, and someone brave enough to answer. The invisible bonds that tie families together can stretch across decades, but they never truly break. They just wait, patient as scars, for the right moment to pull us home.